Well, good morning, Downsview. Pastor Pete here outside on a beautiful midweek, I guess it's mid-Wednesday or midweek morning on a Wednesday morning. I want to encourage you this morning to consider some of the truths that we've seen in Acts chapter 15 this morning, verse 35 and following. The text, of course, is what is a relatively well-known disagreement between the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. And it's an odd passage for us to understand in a lot of ways because it's just so unfamiliar to us and so odd to us to think about two brothers like this who are so involved in the gospel partnership, and they just couldn't come to an agreement. And the disagreement was over this man named John Mark. And if you read the passage in Acts 15:35 and following, the Apostle Paul wants to go and visit the churches that he had planted with Barnabas back on their first missionary journey. And they want to do that to see how they're doing, to follow up, to see how they can care for them. Wonderful, wonderful thing to do. Not just to plant the church and leave it, but to see that there's disciples out there and realize they need mentoring and discipling. And he says, let's go, Barnabas. But the text reminds us that Barnabas wanted to bring Mark, also called John, or the great French disciple Jean Mark. And we want him to come with us, Barnabas says, and Paul doesn't. And Paul says, essentially, look, John Mark booked out during our first trip, and we don't need no quitters to come with us the second time. Barnabas essentially wants him to come along, and although we don't have any dialogue specifically what Barnabas said, you can imagine it was similar to sort of the other end of it. I think that's fair in the text, that it was Paul had one side and Barnabas had the other. Barnabas essentially saying, come on now, everybody deserves a second chance. And, he was young, he was immature, who knows, there are plenty of reasons why he wouldn't have stuck it out the first time, but now he wants to go a second time, and let's give him a go. And frankly, between you and me, I think most of us would tend to agree a little bit with the attitude that Barnabas has, and think that the attitude that the Apostle Paul has might seem a little bit harsh. Either way, we know that the Apostle Paul decides that he's going to take Silas with him, and he's going to go one direction. Well, Barnabas says, well, then I'll take John Mark on my own, and we're going to go another direction. And the Apostle Paul, of course, eventually meets up with this young man, Timothy, who becomes a key disciple of his. Barnabas and John Mark make their way through another region, and they are involved in the gospel ministry. And I think that one of the lessons that may be obvious from it, but might be good for us to just see that we restate it, is that you can have legitimate disagreement within brothers and sisters in the gospel ministry, and the gospel ministry can still go forward. Every disagreement that we have doesn't have to end in disunity. And I'm not so sure that what we see there is a lack of unity as much as a lack of agreement. And sometimes I think in Christian circles we confuse those two things. That the only basis for unity is full agreement on everything that we're doing. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that you can both believe totally different things and still be involved in the same ministry. But there's a sense that, listen, I think we should go this direction. Well, I think we should go this direction. Okay, we talk it out, we work it through for a little while, and then when we think, well, you know what, we just don't agree. And so I'm going to go do this mission, and you go do that mission. And most of you know that at the end of Paul's life in 2 Timothy, as he is closing up the letter in chapter 4, that he actually asks Timothy to bring him a number of things and a number of people to come and visit him. And he asks for John Mark in particular, for he was a faithful brother in the ministry. And whether they had a real falling out, or whether the falling out was actually with Barnabas, whether they just had a sense of a determination to go a little different direction in their ministry. Either way, we all should be very encouraged when we see that this lack of agreement didn't lead, at least in the long term, in the ultimate sense, to a lack of fellowship in the gospel. And that even at the end of Paul's life, he can actually thank God for Timothy, and as well as thanking God for John Mark and Barnabas, and be grateful for what they were able to seek to accomplish together. There are good lessons for us in the evangelical church nowadays, whereas I think too much of unity holds as a requirement uniformity, that we must believe precisely the same things in every case, or there's just no way that we can minister, worship, even fellowship, or have any kind of interaction together. I am not one to downplay the truth of the gospel for the sake of partnerships. I think true partnership is only found in an agreement on the essentials of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, of the authority of the word, of the sufficiency and efficiency and the centrality of the Lord Jesus Christ, the reality that justification is found in no one else but him and no other way but him. Having said that, there are aspects of the gospel ministry that we can participate in and even learn from one another in this world that does not require absolute agreement. And perhaps the lesson that is there in the book of Acts is that gospel ministry continues even when our agreements don't. And God is not bound by our agreements, or frankly, bound by or disrupted by my lack of, or my presence of pettiness, perhaps, my smallness, the things that I am so sure have to be important, and yet the Lord Jesus can overcome even those things. I'm grateful for that. I know you're grateful for that what we see there in the book of Acts is the gospel ministry continuing to go forward even in the face of this disagreement between these folks. And so I want us just to consider again as Downsview, and as we're considering coming back together again, just remember how grateful we should be for our brothers and sisters in the Lord who see some things a little differently than us. I'm not talking about compromising the gospel for a minute. I can hear some of you saying, "You're not saying that." Of course I'm not saying that. You know me as a gospel preacher, gospel person, someone who has very limited associations in some ways because, frankly, it's a small circle, even in Toronto, where you have a real commitment to the scriptures and therefore to the Lord Jesus. But there are aspects of learning from and taking advice from and, frankly, being grateful for even folks who see things in an extraordinarily different way than us. I'm not suggesting that because you can learn from them that you say those things don't matter. The Apostle Paul and Barnabas certainly did not say that those things don't matter. They showed how much they mattered, and they voted with their feet because they didn't work together in that particular sense. I do think, though, there is an example of coming together for the gospel and seeing the gospel ministry continue to go forward. And I pray that that's something that, even in these times of slowly getting back together, that one of the lessons that we can come back together with is the camaraderie of the evangelical church, how we have helped and cared for one another in a lot of different ways during these days. So again, can I ask you, friends, at Downsview to pray for me personally, for our fellow deacons, for Grant and for Raphael, for Errol and for Ivan, for Ranillo, as we seek to figure out how we can get this reservation system in place. If God is moving you to be part of the solution or willing to help somehow, we would be very grateful to hear from you. As I said, I'm not quite sure how we proceed unless some folks will step up and do it. And we're praying for that, and we're praying for some of you by name. We have some ideas, but we'd appreciate it if you would keep that in mind, as that's just a central part of what we see coming back together is going to require. We will be having our Facebook Live again this evening for the second announcement here, that At 7 o'clock tonight, we'll be looking at a lesson from Tibidi Anyabule, who is the pastor at Anacostia River Church in Washington, D.C., and it is a lesson on how to avoid being overcome by temptations. So that'll be tonight at 7 o'clock. Just go to my Facebook page and you'll find it there. All right, friends. Lord bless you today. Cheers.